Okay, 1 second. Share. Yeah, can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this is the minimal stuff. So the first two columns here, I think describes the problem, and the last thing kind of describes the proposed solution using resolutions, but I'm not sure what it means conceptually. So on the left, we have our basic definition here that you have two commodities and some kind of way of transforming from one to the other, right? Some way of going from one to the other. And our question is, okay, we said that there's this thing called a use set for every commodity. And if every commodity has something, then you can say, okay, well, maybe it's a functor, right? It's like attaching some information to every object in your category. So that's what this U is, right? U takes everything in our first category and translates it into the second category. Second category is the category of use sets or use values, and that's fine because the reason we need this is it allows us to distinguish between simply commodity preserving arrows and commodity producing arrows. So commodity preserving arrows basically says like the both objects have to be commodities, right? There has to be something in the use set of the target, and there's also something in the the exchange set of the target.
Yeah. Right. Oh, the thing before both of this is that we defined a commodity as being something which has this use set and exchange set being not empty, right? Yeah. That's why this is preserving that property which you like. It's before the first thing you wrote, right?
Yeah. Even before we can even speak of a category in some sense. The
reason why I'm saying this is because I think that like preliminary step which you didn't add here, which is right before you even define, like this operation from A to B, we define the idea that A and B are commodities if they have non-empty use and exchange set. So I think that's already where the sin, like the original sin is, it's very set-like, that first step, whereas it should be a conclusion and not a preliminary presupposition. But just to not skip that fact, right?
Yeah, exactly. We assume that underlying these commodities is this like set-like quality, right? We don't know what's in it. We just know it's a multiplicity. There's something that we can trace back to set theory, right?
Question really quick. Would the exchange set not in some way be like a subset or embedded within the use set, right? Because you could say that, the exchange itself is a use of a commodity, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So then really for, I guess then it's, it's either exchangeable or if it has use. I was just saying, because if exchange is always a subset of use, you don't necessarily need both.
Yeah, but the thing is, like in the primer, the way we defined, like the exchange set, we were very explicit. Is the set of it's a list of all the other commodities a commodity exchange for. So the content of the exchange set is not its own use set, it's the use set of other commodities. Right? So the exchange set of a shoe does not contain that shoe, or does not only contain that shoe, it contains everything else you can exchange it for. Right? So to have a non-empty exchange set means to be exchangeable with something.
Right. I think that's why, I think BE is it's not a direct subset of BU, but it is like in one-to-one with some things in BU, right?
Yeah. So that's, you see, like that preliminary definition of the exchange set, I think it's already like in the actual development of the primer, it's not mobilized anywhere as such, like in this set-like quality. So it's something that was very explicitly defined, but it's kind of forgotten as we go. And the use set was defined again as a sort of, first it was defined as a set of like with elements and so on, as if it was directly the substrate of the object. And then we refined it to say, no, like everything, the infinite things that an object contains, that's not the use set. The use set in a capitalist economy are those parts of the substrate which are caught up in the capitalist production. So they are either, you know, inputs or outputs in commodity preserving operations. So that's a subset of the substrate, right? Or not even a subset. It's actually, we're actually collecting the arrows that mobilize that substrate and not the substrate itself. But that was some later addition and kind of in passing, like. But just to say that's kind of what's in this empty space here, right?
That reminds me, it almost seems like the use set is like more transcendental in the sense that it's not kind of like my I guess metaphor before with like real and rational numbers are like when we talk about when you were talking about before in the WhatsApp about how exchange kind of seems like it comes prior to everything else, right? That's just because like that's like what we see, I guess, in the world, right? That's like what we can get data from. We can see this was exchanged for this, so there must be, so it must be exchangeable. So it feels like, to me, this is like, I don't have a very specific, but intuitively it feels like the exchange set is like constructive, right? You can see things out and you can construct it like physically, and the use set is almost like transcendental. It's like this like infinite thing that you can't necessarily quantify, right? Like from within the world, but it does exist sort of in context based on, I guess, the entire, like you said, the capitalist mode of production, what is possible for each thing.
I like that. I like the I mean, we can go further after Dennis presents it, because I do think that there's something about density on the side of the use set, in the sense that you're always probing it, the stuff you can take out of it is never fully what's there. You always know there's more there than the things you get to actually, you know, entangle in the web of exchange and production. And it's like much more dense and kind of local. Everything can be rewritten in terms of it ultimately, right? Even though it's framed by the exchange, right? So there is very interesting connections, I think.
I agree. Yeah. If we were to say like the max limit of the exchange set is every other commodity in the world, right?
Yeah,
like, it's a finite set at most, whereas the use set could be infinite.
Yeah, I'm just pointing this out because I think rereading the primer, one thing that like kept being kind of confusing and unclear to me is like physically like what the use set really is. And even though we might not be able to like explicitly say like this set with all these elements is the use set of this one thing, we can probably get some other things out of it. But it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. When I was first thinking of this, I was trying to think of the use set or the use functor as very similar to the POM functor in because we ended up drawing, we did this two things, right? C star and star C. So we had all arrows where C was one of the inputs or in the domain, and all arrows where C is in the codomain, right? And this matches in category theory. You have these like covariant and contravariant functors.
Shit.
You back?
Yeah, sorry guys.
Yeah, anyway, so yeah, this Hom thing was the original like idea. We don't know exactly what's in the use sets, but I wanted it formally to work like a Hom set because
Yeah.
it would lend itself to like our understanding of sheaves and so on later, or at least pre-sheaves, right? Because the Hom functor is I think a pre-sheave.
Yeah, the use set, it should be like the C blank, right? It's
Exactly.
the things that you can do with C.
Yeah, things you can do with
within
C.
this. Yeah.
Okay, so we have commodity preserving. So this is kind of like a tautological thing almost. I mean, based on what Gabriel was saying, we know B is, I mean, for B to even be in the category in the first place, this has to be true. So for there to be arrows between A and B, it just means like A and B are in the same category. And there's a way to get from A to B. But commodity producing is when we first add in a new idea. We say, okay, there's some uses in A that are not in B, or vice versa. Like they're not the same, meaning you produce something from the starting point. And I think here maybe we didn't add enough. There needs to be more rules, because even in exchange, the elements of the second thing of the exchange, sorry, when you exchange A for B, the elements in the use set of B are different from the use set of A. So this would be true in exchange as well. So this definition is not specific enough to distinguish between exchange and production, but that was our idea, that there needs to be something that describes production here. So that's one source of the problem, right? It's by itself, it's not horrible, but then this is where the real issue comes in, this middle part here. We say in section 3 that to say that A is exchangeable with B means that there's a pair of arrows, F and F minus, such that, you know, composing F with F minus gets us back to the starting thing. And this is like saying I exchanged my thing for something else, but then that means that somebody else was able to exchange B for A. So hypothetically, you could do the same thing again and get back to where you started, right? Exchangeability and isomorphism kind of mean the same thing in the category.
Well, I think you have to be, don't you have to be specific when you say isomorphism, because it's isomorphism within which category, right? So two things are isomorphic in terms of their exchange, like within, I guess, like some like market category type thing, right? But things being isomorphic in production is very different. It's not just whether they can be exchanged, it's whether they can be used in the same productive capacity, right? And not make
exactly. And that's where it's contradictory, because if U is a functor, then U preserves isomorphism. So if you're an isomorphism in the domain of this functor U, then wherever U takes you, you will also be an isomorphism. But exactly, like as you said, the market, if this top blue diagram is the market, going to the factory or the production site, A and B are definitely not isomorphic, right? A book and a shoe or whatever, they can't be used in production. So that means that U is not a well-defined functor. It doesn't satisfy this. Or we have a problem with this, right? I mean, there's different ways we could try to solve it, but right now this doesn't work, because it implies that the use of A is isomorphic with the use of B, which is not true, just because A is exchangeable with B.
Which is actually the opposite, which is the conceptually kind of common sense, right? You wouldn't exchange A with B if they had the same use to begin with. So
exactly. Okay, so then one solution proposed, I think Gabriel proposed it, was using resolution. So the way resolution works currently, it actually depends on the definition of the use sets. And what the resolution is, it is both a set and a functor. We actually write it differently. If it's the set, it's the triangle. If it's the functor, we use like a stylized C with a triangle. That this is the functor version, but in this case, we don't need to care about this. And this set, in the set form, the resolution takes elements from use sets. So think of it as a box. You can put any uses of a thing into this box. And whenever you put things into this box that are shared by two commodities, that means those two commodities are indistinguishable when you apply the functor, right? So, I don't know, rope and vines, I don't know, or you can use a rope or you can use vines to tie something together, right? So if the delta set only cares about tying things together, I need something to tie something, I don't really care whether it's rope or vine, then we allow you to take the original category of commodities and transform it into one where ropes and vines become isomorphic. Right, that's actually captured in this part here.
So that would be, there would be isomorphic in, right, the category as uses.
As uses, yeah, as uses. So this we have a mechanism to make things isomorphic in uses, and we added this isomorphism with exchanges, right? So the proposal is to somehow include into the use sets the definition of exchangeability, such that we're basically saying when two things are exchangeable, that's already because there's a resolution that made it that way, if that makes sense. If that makes sense, right? Like, it's not like two things are absolutely exchangeable. It's that we applied the resolution functor such that these two things look the same. But I'm not sure if that fixes all the problems. What that means is under this resolution, we cannot tell the difference in their use sets either, right? Because once you apply this resolution to it, you do get this isomorphism between A and B, but you also have to say that their uses are isomorphic.
But are their uses isomorphic in the same way that, for example, in like the rope example?
Yeah, their uses, you can say their uses are isomorphic under this resolution.
Yeah,
So
it seems like it's almost like they're isomorphic in almost like some measure on the uses, which might be value, right?
Their
like
uses are, yeah, their uses are isomorphic.
It's something like the size of AU and the size of BU, that they're the same in some sense. I don't know exactly how to define that right now.
Like their cardinality of the
ish, yeah, maybe not literally their cardinality, but it would be some kind of way of, right, that's kind of what value is. It's some way of measuring and comparing uses at different resolutions, right?
Well, would it make sense from, I'm not sure it makes sense from the formal point of view, but if the problem is that if you start with the exchangeability between the commodities, and so you already have some sort of isomorphism, and then you have a functor that takes you to use set, and then the problem is that you cannot introduce a difference. Couldn't the opposite work? So either the exchangeability is like a functor that that is applied onto already the use set. So a functor that, so actually another solution I was thinking that this other, I had interpreted in another way, that you had this sort of like substrate A and B, and then you had also like a functor that springs out of this A and B, which is the functor of exchange values. So when two things is exchangeable from the point of view of the exchange functor, you would introduce the equality, but from the original like A and B, you don't have to assume that they are isomorphic. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what we're saying on this third column, which is like you have the substrate, but the substrate it's not a commodity. The substrate is like an item, like it's a physical thing or whatever. It's a service maybe, but it's not commodified yet, right?
Mhm.
When you apply the exchange functor, what you're calling the exchange functor, I think I'm interpreting that as saying like you're moving it into the commodity universe, right? You're thinking of it in the commodity sense. And once you're in the commodity universe, you're implicitly always looking at it from a certain resolution. And we're saying like from that resolution, two things are isomorphic when their substrate, their ontological character can be completely different. Doesn't matter what they are. They don't need to be isomorphic outside of the commodity world. They just need to be isomorphic within the commodity world. And that's what we do have a way to say that with resolution. But then the additional statement is that under that resolution, their uses must also be isomorphic, because use is a functor and functors preserve isomorphism.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, I totally dropped out and then came back. If you guys already presented a bunch of stuff, I'm not sure if I'm lagging behind, but shouldn't we take this the inverse way? Because what you just presented is not, I mean, the way that resolutions can solve this is not by coming in last, is by arriving at exchange from it, right? So to say that the restriction is in the inverse direction, like there is a resolution under which you could say that A and B are isomorphic in exchange, and that resolution is the one that doesn't preserve any use property, right? So it would be in the inverse direction, like you have all this stuff happening at the use set level, composition, resolutions, different attributes. And then you say, well, there is one attribute under which A and B can be said to be isomorphic, even though at all other resolutions, that's probably not the case, or most resolutions, that's not the case, except under very specific restrictions. Like, as we always say, like cedar wood and pine wood are like they are isomorphic in terms of use for a specific process, right? But under those specifications, generally use sets are not isomorphic. There is one resolution where they are in principle isomorphic, which is the attribute which doesn't preserve any attribute. So it would be, in that case, it's closer to what Yasha was saying in the beginning, where this functor here between A and B is actually a functor that only obtains when you have a resolution here, which is a specific resolution, which is the resolution which didn't preserve any elements of the use set, right? Or any attributes, like nothing falls under it.
Yeah. My problem here though is, doesn't that lead us to a situation where all commodities are isomorphic to all other commodities? Let's say A and B are now isomorphic. Why is A and B not isomorphic to a third commodity C, and so on? Like, what lets us?
Yeah, why is this restricted? Why is this still informative and not trivial?
Yeah.
That's why I have the impression that all solutions, like this is where I'm at right now. Like I think all solutions that accept this first step and these definitions and tries to solve it, they won't be really good. Like, I think that this is where the problem is. Like this, what we call a use set and exchange set should be like, you know, this is the whole cool thing about this sort of categorical approach, locales and things like this, right? That you recuperate meaningful points out of pointless definitions, right? And I think that actually is much closer to our intuition. Like the way we originally framed, like I remember in the first meeting where I think Renzo brought this issue up, like I find this confusing the way you define, and then we had this idea like, yeah, consider a set which is the substrate, then imagine that there is a subset of this, which is the use set, which is a set of all arrows that go here that like have commodities here, right? Or here. And this set is the use set, right? And then resolutions that interest the capitalist world are the resolutions that will restrict this further. But like first we had this defined as a sort of multiple. And then we introduced this more fuzzy use set on top. We could do the inverse, right? We could start with more robust definitions of what it means to have maps from commodities to commodities, and just call these objects commodities. We don't know much about them yet, and then derive, you know, under which conditions can we say that some X that belongs to A is said to be part of the use set of A, right? Sorry, part, right? So to approach the set definition of use from the definition of parts entangled in some use of the commodity, and then says the set of all commodity preserving uses, that's what we call the use set. But then we need to invert the order of reasons that we did. Start with something set-like, and then try to build on top of it, because that seems to be, that's my impression. That first step is where I think we already went a bit wrong. That's why
so you're saying we should start with uses more fundamentally, right? Like I don't know if I'm interpreting this correctly, but it seems like this functor almost should in the middle, almost should go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, my intuition was going in the direction of flipping these arrows, like starting from the most like singular and a specific thing, which is like the substrate, and then you build some sort of rich structure of like use sets and parts and all like the rich structure of production, which relates how parts of a certain substrate can be taken into like other commodities through production. And then exchangeability is sort of like the really like it has to forget a lot of this structure and only find like a small subset of arrows which preserve value. So it's like it's the most like coarser. At the same time, like it's coarse because it will eliminate a lot of the production edges and just leave out like these arrows that make commodities exchangeable. So this isomorphism that loses a lot of difference is the last thing that comes, right?
Yeah.
Which is value, most abstract thing. So the order seems to like spring from substrate to use and production, and finally to at least this, and finally to exchange.
Yeah, the thing that I think gets in the way of that, Renzo, is the thing that Dennis asked. Like, if you start with this delta resolutions of A and B, and then you say that there is some sort of move where under a specific resolution for these two things, you then say that you only preserve their exchange kind of quality. The problem is that it's very hard to at the same time lose all that information and not make this trivial. Why would only some commodities be exchanged at this forgetful level that didn't preserve any use information, right? That's why just like
I know. Well, are are they not preserving any use though? Aren't they just preserving like a minimal sort of use, right?
Yeah,
They're
right.
only preserving a use in like the exchange value.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that the thing that we risk happening there is that it's not true that looking at the use of two commodities, we can establish if they're exchangeable or not, right? Like there's nothing like, yeah, the use of the shoe has something to do with the use of the cigarettes. That's why they are exchangeable.
Mhm.
It's actually the fact that the use value of one is inside the exchange set of the other. And that's kind of arbitrary at first, before you have like a consistent space, right? So for example, there is a property that I mentioned yesterday that I think might be helpful, because in my head, the archetype of what we're talking about still is the distinction between atomic logic and relations in Badiou sense, like the sort of conservation and, you know, what we talk about when we talk about exchange. If you forget, like if you make the epistemological bracketing of the fact that when we talk about exchange, it seems like it's all about things exchanging hands. But that's not really what exchange is about. That's what property alienation is about. Property alienation comes from the dimension of rights. I have something that means you don't have. But exchangeability and exchange is not really like immanently, it's not about that, right? That's why in a chapter on the metamorphosis of the commodity, that as Marx calls it, he talks about the fact that like what truly makes the market look like it's moving, it's not that things are changing hands so much as things are leaving the market, because once they change hands, they're consumed. So the immanent appearance of movement between commodities is actually consumption. You know, it's not like if you abstract from human agents and look just at commodities, it's kind of like a Galilean relativity. You can't really tell if they're always moving and changing hands or if they're static, because it's equivalent by equivalent. And at the level of a sensor that only sees, you know, commodities, that doesn't make any difference. But they will be consumed in different projects or production structures depending on where they live. So I don't think so. If you remove that issue, you don't need to go as far in the definition of exchange as to show that they changed hands. That's not really the core. The core is that if they were exchanged, their use sets still exist. It's a transformation that doesn't affect their use. It's like if I have a 1 kilo of rice and you have some beans and we exchange, the rice exists and the beans exist. So I think that's the most immanent and immediate quality. So my idea is that if you want to say that A and B were exchanged, or A was exchanged by B, how can we capture this? It actually means that there is a third commodity that could still be exchanged by B or exchanged by A, because both of them still exist.
Yeah. Here we're running into the way mathematics treats transformation as if I have a number 2 and I have a function that squares everything, right? And it turns it into a 4. I'm not really saying I'm consuming the 2 and now I have now you have the 4, right? The 2 is still there. The only thing this is saying is just like there is a relation between this 2 and the 4. But when we talk about transforming commodities, we are there's this temptation to say like commodities are
becoming something.
Yeah, commodities becoming some other commodity.
Yeah, so this thing here, I think, captures the fact that exchange is a relation in Badiou sense. It's a conservation. So the atomic structure of A and that everything that is part of A remains part of A. Everything that's part of B remains part of B. But there is something that could now be also exchanged for B or exchanged for A, because both of them still exist. They were preserved. So this third thing sees the fact that both were preserved. Now, imagine that A was consumed in the making of B. There is no C that can be exchanged for B or A, because A is no longer there. A was consumed. A is now, let's say, part of B or something like that, right? So this doesn't exist. So that's a way of distinguishing what does it mean to get caught up in consumption or production, which captures a difference between the two without having to talk about sets, only about mappings, and in very small amount. Like, I'm not sure, I don't think this is written properly, right? But I think you could translate this in saying that when, like, to go back to our set-like definition, production implies that the exchange set of A no longer exists, it's empty, because after being consumed, you cannot exchange it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So-
but this is where I'm like confused, because what does it mean to say before and after? What is there a before you squared a 2 and an after you squared a 2? I mean, there's no sense of time here, right? It's just saying this is a rule.
Yeah, but we don't want to define time so much as we want to define this arrow, right? And the fact is this arrow sense, like, I think that the very simplest thing that I'm saying is, if this is an exchange arrow, it means that this relation can be seen by a third commodity. And if this arrow is something else than exchange, if it's some sort of composition between A and B, there is no third commodity that can see both, that can see this arrow, like that can be the object version of that relation, right?
Yeah, okay, so you're saying.
So I think time is just, it's just a way of talking about, like, for example, if I say, yeah, let's take an example that's not from this field, like yeah, I'm trying to think of an example, like.
I've got a question at this point, because it seems like when we're talking, like in the way Marx kind of moves through in the first part, I can't remember if it's the end of the first part or the second part where he concludes with production, circulation, and their dialectic. But I think maybe one way to parse it out would be that time becomes a problem at the level of circulation and production, but it's not a problem at the level of exchange and use.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point where temporality becomes important, the cycle of production, the cycle of kind of instantiate, like realization of surplus value. But I totally agree with Dennis that at this level, this shouldn't be like, this doesn't exist for commodities, right? Turnover time doesn't exist. We don't have enough machinery for that to be intelligible from the standpoint of a commodity. But what I'm trying to suggest is that there might be, not this one perhaps, right? But there might be, for example, perhaps this is the right way to write this, right? We say that A, like, goes into the making of B, if B then can be exchanged for C, and there's a, like, the only way to see A is to see A as part of B, like, right, like something like this. So there is nothing that sees, there is no commodity that can, well, I can change it either for A or exchange it for B. I can choose between the two. I can only, to choose A means to choose B, because A is now part of B. Whereas if there was just an exchange, I can still choose to exchange C for A or for B.
Yeah, I think this gets confusing a bit, because what if there's a commodity that can be transformed into 2 other commodities, and those 2 other commodities are, like, I can't think of an example exactly, but like you're basically saying, like, no triangle, no commutativity in a triangle formation unless it's an exchange relation. And I'm thinking, what if there's like a production relation that is a triangle as well?
but all these arrows here are all the same, right? I'm not saying that this production will never fall into some commutative stuff. I'm just saying that.
Oh, you're saying all these are isomorphic. A, B, and C are all isomorphic here.
Yeah, I'm trying to suggest that perhaps perhaps there's a way to arrive at a distinction of exchange and consumption of a commodity only in terms of maps at the level that we are, because at the level, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is that at this level, what do we have? We don't even have the notion of substrate, because we added those three things: a substrate, a use set, and an exchange set first.
Mhm.
Then at the second level, we added the idea of these mappings, right? And then we restricted it using this prior definition. So 1 plus 2 gave us like, wow, these are commodity preserving, commodity producing, and so on. And I'm saying that we should avoid this. Take this second point to be our starting point. See if we can flesh it out a bit more in terms, for example, of isn't the fact that something like this commutes at this very general level already a bit more of information? So can we compose maps or not? Perhaps that distinction is already more information, and it allows us to then arrive at a distinction between what falls in use and what falls in exchange. So I'm just saying, let's stick with this a bit more, see if we can find a property just in terms of the paths that composition allows us to take with commodities. Perhaps it's something a bit more sophisticated than what I'm saying, but perhaps just insist on that a bit and see if, for example, we won't find two different diagrams that are different, but one captures a bit more of what concerns exchange and the other captures a bit more what concerns consumption. For example, wouldn't it be the case that another idea that production isn't it almost like, doesn't it guarantee that you usually have two things becoming another? Can you have production of only one object going to the other? I mean, with our definition of commodities, yes, because we can just call this a bundle, right?
Yeah, that's what we did. We combined them using either product, co-product, or more generally like monoid thing.
Yeah. So for example, the product and co-product thing. I remember you added a condition saying, look, you only get to slice commodities back into their, like a bundle into their parts, if they are not caught up in production, like they're not composed in any intrinsic way, they're just extrinsically tied together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of, that idea that not all arrangements of commodities allows you to bundle them, then unbundle. When you produce, you bundle, but you cannot unbundle.
Right.
But that's a distinction that might be prior to the distinction between use and exchange.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like a purely categorical definition in terms of maps.
Yeah.
Is more ideal than saying like, oh, we have these sets and we define things by sets. You know? Because
you see, like my impression is that what we want is to actually arrive at this set, like to have a filter out to set, saying that you can treat those parts that preserve those mappings, the parts of those objects that preserve those mappings, they can be treated as a set. And that mapping into set is what we call the use set, or what we call the exchange set, right?
Yeah.
What you're saying right now, Gabriel, is also resonating with what I've been reading in linear logic, because one of the interesting things there is the modal operator, which lets you suspend treating your premises as resources which are exhausted when you and that seems like something very much like exchange right here, whereas like production is the kind of default semantics and syntax of linear logic, and then you can kind of like deactivate that. It also goes with the fact that they've got 4 instead of 2 operators, and the idea of starting with kind of like the bundling and the composing maps is where they start. And they start with what I think would be interesting to look at, because in 2.3 or 4 you guys talk about 2.3 you talk about products and co-products, and in linear logic you have both a disjunction and a conjunction for each one of those, for a product and a co-product. And so that might give us some more like suppleness in trying to actually like describe these relations. for these connections.
Yeah, we did consider using linear logic. I think it would probably be closer to what the type of thing we're doing, but yeah, we're not familiar enough with it too.
Yeah, but I think that for that, I mean, this is the point. Like you capture just a tiny little bit of the idea of a resource that is expendable by the idea that you cannot project. You call it a commodity projection, right? When you have a bundle, you did the product, and then you try to uncouple things back, right?
Yeah.
The idea that combinations are not reversible, it's like a proto-entropic idea, right? Of something, once you've done it, like it introduces time, but not time. Like it's not a discussion of steps, it's just an operation.
Right.
But the idea that I can combine stuff and I cannot decompose them back and get both back, it does capture something of the idea that these things were combined irreversibly, right? So without introducing time, oh, it's because after the operation something happened. No, the operation itself, because it's irreversible, it implies something cannot go back, right?
Okay. So let's say we were able to do this, then we can throw out use sets and exchange sets and do a purely using limits or using like product and coproducts. We're able to define what it means to produce things and exchange things. That still leaves the trouble of when we want to talk about use and the difference between use and exchange later on, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know,
to
like
go
the isomorphism.
No, I agree with you, but like,
yeah.
So first thing is that when the question if there is an isomorphism between use and exchange, I mean, everything now is, you need to think about it I think that, I mean, it's much closer to the spirit of the thing, because one of the things we're approaching more and more, and I think the primer is in a large measure able to do, is that we never have kind of stratified, like substantial distinction, right? Quality and quantity are regionally defined, right? Under certain, like for money, things appear quantitative, but for money, they're not. So it's much more fluid. Some of the dualities that Marx starts from, right? Before the first page of Capital, you're presupposing that quality is different from quantity. You're presupposing that, there is an atom of matter in use value, and there is no atom of matter in exchange value. Therefore, they are like two domains, right? And in our approach, those things are introduced. They're not presupposed. So those dualities are regional dualities. And I think that has a very, very, very huge advantage, because it makes a huge amount of debates about value versus exchange value, abstract labor, is it a real thing or not? All those things are cast in our project. They appear in a different way. So I think that we should always strive towards that, right? And I think that this idea of somehow use and exchange are actually different restrictions, right, in the constrained space of commodities. If you constrain your transformations in some way, what's left is exchange, right? If I tell everyone who's holding commodities in their hand, guys, the only things you're allowed to do right now is to do things with your commodities that don't change their use. Pretty much what's left in a certain level, right, is exchange. You can say, oh, but you need to know what it means to use to enforce that rule, right? So perhaps we could, if this approach is correct, the one we just mentioned, it would be something like, don't do anything with your commodity which would compromise it being exchanged with someone else later, right? So you can combine it bundle it, but it must be a trivial bundle, because you need to be able to remove it from there and still exchange it with a third, something like that. or the inverse, like to restrict it in such a way that guys now only combine your commodities in such a way that they're not around to be exchanged afterwards. You either destroy them, consume them, or produce them. So you have like, okay, I'm being very simplistic, but just so you see, like we're talking about framing a constraint that the output of that constraint is either use or exchange. That's what we're looking for, right? And then I think what we want to say is there is a mapping of these transformations to set. So we're introducing like a pointy element-like approach to this, which is attaching each one of those kind of allowed transformations to a set, to an element of a set. And we're saying, well, that's the set of use, that's the set of exchange, right? So they are coming at the end, not coming at the beginning. We still can bring in use sets and exchange sets. We just want to make them appear at the end. And because we have a category first and we restricted its mappings to get the use and to get the exchange, it's not true that the only way to relate the two is directly via a functor, which I think is the problem. Like if they are the initial terms, use and exchange set, then well, the only thing I can do is to relate them. And then I need to say, okay, but what property is preserved from one to the other? Mm-hmm. Whereas if I first define the restriction from C to exchange space and from C to consumption space, like I'll have a triangle where I know that there are two arrows, and the arrow that connects use and exchange is actually enriched by the other two.
Right. Yes. I think that is the solution. I'm trying to think about it though. Like, so you have this bigger space, right? Where you have a big space of all the things you can do with commodities. Mm-hmm. And you want to restrict that space to some consumption space, right? Which you call consumption, right?
Yeah, which can be in production or not. We don't know. That's for now. It's not the issue, right?
Right. So yeah,
we know that consumption whose output is still commodities. That's production.
Right.
So consumption here is just, I guess, use that is not exchange.
Yeah, exactly. It's the use side. Yeah.
It's the use side. And then you're saying there's another way of constraining that we get to an exchange space.
Yeah.
And that has a given set of isomorphisms, right? Because like we said, exchange spaces can vary across. I mean, we want to say that there can be many exchange spaces, right? There's a space where. Yeah,
I think space is not the right word. Like,
is that the same as bargaining space, or we had a?
Yeah, no, that's why I wouldn't use space. Like it's the domain of consumption transformations and domain of exchange transformations, right? But if they are all congruent, consistent, if they form a space, like that's not what we're talking about. Like it's space in the sense of it's just the morphisms restricted to those which we would call exchange, right? If they are all consistent among, that's not really, exchange morphisms and consumption morphisms, right? It's looser than spaces.
Yeah, I mean, we basically did this, like we have this O thing, and then we have like C, like C star, and, or maybe it's the other way around, C comma star. We did something like this later on the text. Yeah. So now we're saying this goes in the beginning, right?
It's like,
and we don't explicitly say, like, in set theoretic terms, there's something that distinguishes these from these. We try to define it more imminently. Why is it that some arrows are consumption and some arrows are exchange? Yeah, we have to say somehow show that that's an imminent definition to the category itself.
Mm-hmm. And so then, just to clarify, what's O again here? Like what are exactly the errors? Just all uses?
All operations that you can do to a to a commodity.
Okay, so that's contingent on, I guess, like the capitalist space or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like some set of reasons and possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's basically, I mean, we can say like it's basically the co-limit of, or whatever, the if you add in the consumption morphisms and the exchange morphisms, you pretty much have O, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're just basically like partitioning O into these two types of morphisms.
Yeah. And it seems to me that, for example, the two candidates in my mind most intuitively to allow you to make this is to say there is some type of composition of these arrows, of these operations that, for example, that first idea that I had with the commuting triangle for exchange, meaning everything, any relation that A has to B, it will be called an exchange relation at this level if it preserves the possibility that some other commodity can still be, exchanged with the first one that went to the relation. So it might be too loose because, for example, you could bundle A and B. Now they are AB, this bundle of commodities. That you didn't exchange the two. You just counted them together. That's a very trivial thing. And you can still exchange C either for B or for A. So perhaps that commuting thing is too weak, right? To capture the idea that something is, that you conserve the two commodities, even though they related in some way, right? But
yeah, right now we say exchange morphisms, they come in pairs. They're all isomorphisms. They're all invertible, let's say.
mm-hmm.
That's the defining feature of exchange morphisms. But you're saying instead of, because yeah, that's where we run into the whole problem with this thing, right? Because we're interpreting isomorphism as exchangeability. But isomorphism is a more general concept than,
yeah, but there are two ways to solve this, right? Either by changing this property as a defining one, or by removing this as the way you connect, use, and exchange, right? Because if you go to the other page, like what you're doing now is like having some space here and saying that we know these two arrows to use and to exchange, right? So whatever arrow we add here, it has some information coming from these two. So it's not like totally pure, right? So if there is a arrow going from use to exchange or vice versa, whatever arrow it is, it needs to preserve this property here. Or inversely, it needs to preserve this property here, right? So I'm not sure like if this would just be a very loosely defined functor between the two. It might be something more specific. Like,
yeah, that's the problem. Like if we're doing this, like I think going from X to U to E is fine. But going from X to E to U, that's where the problem is. This way is a problem.
Yeah, but can it be directed to one way?
Well, because it's commutative, right? I mean, unless we're saying it's not commutative, that's fine too. But if it's commutative, that means going from X to E to U is the same as going from X to U, and this is
well. But why not the inverse? Just have this arrow going the other way.
Mm-hmm.
X to U to E exists, but X to E doesn't go to U.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if something is exchangeable, it must have a use. But if something is useful, doesn't mean it's exchangeable.
Yeah.
And I mean, the crucial qualities of U and E are given by these ones, right?
Yeah, use is a much richer space.
Yeah, much richer.
Is ultimately the thing that gives us information about the exchange space.
Like for now, I see three possible approaches. Perhaps there are actually four that perhaps some combination of them, perhaps they're similar in more than one way, but like intuitively, I see 4 routes to define G and F. The first one is that idea that I can't even formulate it properly, and it seems too vague, to say that there is some sort of triangulation that is preserved for exchange, but not otherwise. In that sense that if there was an exchange relation between A and B, exchange relations with A and with B are still possible with other commodities, but that might be too weak. The second path that I see is a resolution path, which is to say E here that you added, it's something like you restricted it to the use, to the compositional consumptive morphisms, and then there's always a resolution change that takes you to E, and it doesn't preserve anything from the use. So it's a resolution approach. It's focused not on defining exchange, but on defining use. The third one that is the cheapest one, but it's the one that I'm having a hard time not thinking it has some merit, is to say, well, ultimately, isn't use about parts and exchange about wholes? Like when I say I exchange A for B, I always say I exchange the whole of A for the whole of B. But when I'm consuming A, I'm consuming the parts of A, right? I mean, it is about what's inside of A, right? It seems, again, it has something to do with the resolution thing, where suddenly all the attributes that can cover the parts in relevant ways are lost, and it's only the commodity itself that is left. But I think it has this nice part, and the idea that, well, if you want to talk about use, you will start having to look at what a thing is composed of. And if you want to look at exchange, that's not really what's at stake. So there's something about part and whole that seems relevant there. And fourth is the product, coproduct, binding things. Can they be uncoupled again once they're bound together or not? Thing, I think, which has this irreversibility thing about use that might be the relevant property as well. So those are 4 kind of intuitive candidates for purely mapping, purely morphic approaches to how to distinguish G and F.
Isn't the one where with, never mind, I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
And I mean, isn't this kind of, isn't these 2 arrows here, they are good to think about this because, well, buy-ins, yeah, kind of.
Yeah, this is the problem. I was trying to get to this, right? This is what this is the whole point of doing this whole category thing, or one of the main points is that we wanted to transcribe the MCM Marxist formula for capital into or I guess MC C prime M prime, that whole formula for capital. We wanted to translate that into a commutative diagram. But this means that the arrows going from M to C are not any different from the arrows going from C to D. So if we go, I think the what I'm afraid of in the option 4 is that it stratifies the exchange arrows. These are exchange arrows, right?
Yeah.
Because you're exchanging money for commodity and exchanging D back for money, right? Buying and selling. If you stratify exchange arrows and production arrows or use arrows, you can't do this commutative thing. I mean, I don't know how to do that, because this is no longer in a single category. You're saying there's a category of uses and a category of exchanges, and there's ways to go in between them. But what about this diagram in which you're exchanging and using and exchanging again, right? And that's in the definition of this phi, which is the capital, like you're increasing money from your starting money to the ending money. The definition of this phi, it requires all 3.
John, D is just another commodity. Sorry, John McGinnis asked us in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
D is just C prime.
Yeah. D is just like the outcome of the production process. So you bought some materials and some labor, right? That goes from M to C. And then you turn that material and labor power into D, and then you sold D for M2. And now you've defined Marx's definition, right? Now you've satisfied Marx's conditions for capital, or at least industrial capital.
For example, but you see, like, how about, you see, like, from these approaches, from these 4 approaches we mentioned, the first one would imply that if this is if this arrow is an exchange arrow, there is some other commodity here that could be exchanged for that amount of money and could be exchanged for these, right?
Yeah. So you're saying
I'm just saying going one by one.
Yeah, a third object guarantees every exchange error. I mean, yeah. So from here to here, there's some object. And then from here to here, there's also some object.
Yeah, that could do this. I traded my money for my commodity. That means I could trade this commodity for something else and then get my money back.
Also, every exchange arrow, doesn't it already depend on a resolution, right? Because anytime you're making some exchange, there's always like some, maybe like think of it like the error bar, like some wiggle room. Or when you exchange one thing for another thing, whether there's like negotiation or whatever, it's never going to be, I'm exchanging for exactly something of this exact value. I'm exchanging for something that might have, like, you know, there might be some difference.
Yeah, but I think that there are 2 arguments there. There's the discussion that the price fluctuation under accidental negotiations can vary, but in the aggregate, there is an attractor, which is value. And the logic that Marx wants to argue for is the logic of that attractor, not the logic of this error margin. I don't think that's where the resolution comes in so much. But I agree with you. But I mean, you see, like, if just to show the merit of each approach, like if you take approach 1, isn't it true that there is an object to go here? There is an object to go here, but there is no object to go here or here. That's exactly why you are producing. If there existed an object Y that I could exchange for everything that was put into production, and I could sell that object Y for the value of everything that's the output of production, I wouldn't produce. I would just buy and sell like a mercantile exchange. So it's only here and here that these triangles commute. Here and here they don't. And that's why this is a valorizing endeavor. So there is something to this first approach that does kind of give information about why this arrow is called E, right? But again, leaving it aside for a bit. The resolution one also is interesting because, like, I forgot that I was the one who drew this thing. Like the resolution one would say something like, I mean, going from mixing these 2 together, right? To buy with money some commodities is to buy them at a resolution where their parts don't matter, right? To combine them to create a new commodity is to go into a resolution where their specific attributes does matter. But then to sell them for more money is to return to a resolution where those attributes don't matter.
Yeah, so here I think we would need to redo or completely change, not completely, but like change our idea of resolution to be, instead of a way to go between categories, it's more like an intra move, like it's within the category that resolution changes happen.
Isn't it already?
Yeah, I thought it was an endofunctor.
Yeah.
No, an endofunctor, but like you apply it to all the commodities, right? So like I guess I'm not seeing the functor being applied here, right? If you exchange money for a commodity, you're in resolution 1. So how do we get from that to resolution 2, where now you're producing D from C? Like,
yeah, what I was thinking is something like I have money here, and again, very, very vulgarly, is like I have a set of properties, but when I'm exchanging money for some commodities, like the only thing that matters, right, is that the set as a whole maps to the set. Like you can say, but there are, I don't know, you exchange 1 centimeter of gold for a meter of some fabric. Yeah, I don't give a shit. Like I'm not looking at the partitions of these things. It's just 1 for 1. It's always 1 for 1, right? Like it's $10 for some object, but $10 is one thing. And those things I bought is just one thing, right? But when I look at production now, and I want to turn this into D, and I have some commodities, it's this little subset and this subset that matters. So this would be something like take the whole set, and production arrows will be take some subsets, right?
Yeah. So actually resolution. So yeah, here the concept of resolution is embedded in the arrows themselves. Like it's when you go from C to D, you're specifying a resolution. Like this is of resolution A, and this is of resolution B.
And you know, like retroactively reading the primer, that's what we already have. Like once we finished presenting our account of OpenRads in production, we had labor resolutions, machine resolutions, and those things determine like at which level a raw material is treated. So there's nothing which is not, let's say, resolution indexed in the production space, right?
Yeah, I'm fine with everything being resolution indexed, but the additional thing we're adding now is that you can compose an arrow from one resolution with an arrow from another one. So let me ask you this then. If you can do that, then what is the resolution of this arrow? Because
yeah, it goes back to the whole. I mean, I'm thinking, again, I'm combining approaches 2 and 4, because it seems to me we're talking about a sort of extreme views of resolution. It is an idea of resolution we haven't used yet, because for now, resolutions, they take us between types, right? That are like predicates that have some qualitative attribute. So cedar wood and pine wood are the same from the standpoint of some sort of robustness predicate, right? That's how we're changing our knob to decide if things have the same or not resolution, right? What we're saying is that when you shift the knob to the exchange mode, it's like you no longer have the means to know what's inside anything. You just take it as a whole. So I'm thinking about this sort of thing that zooms out to something we could call the whole of the commodity, right? The whole only exists as exchange. And in terms of use, it's always a part. It can be like a really huge part. It can be a set of parts that is much larger than the object, like all the uses it can take when being consumed, or all the ways it can be composed in a production process, but it's always this set of parts at stake. Whereas when we're dealing with exchange, it's always the set, right? I mean, that maps nicely to the problem of property, because when you own an object, you don't own a specific use of it. You own the object, like the set of the parts, right? So, I mean, in this case here, it will be, again, forget everything that is inside of this and just see if they relate, right?
Yeah,
as a whole.
But this seems to suggest that every commodity and like within the category, there is both a whole and a set-like or part-like commodity version. So in other words, like M1, because I'm just trying to think of it in terms of like rules that we can set on these. We want to encode our category to obey certain rules, right? So what you're saying, I understand conceptually that between money and C, between M1 and C, you're talking about a whole-to-whole relationship. You're not caring about the individual, right? So the way I am thinking of it is like when you exchange M with CW, that's allowed. But then you need to do a knob turning or a resolution change to get from CW to CP, or what is called like the commodity of it with certain parts involved. Then you can do your production. So CP becomes, I don't know, this DP thing.
Yeah.
And then that is also has parts, right? Because maybe it has some properties that you care about. But then you need to make another resolution change. That's getting really messy in here, but
Perhaps we can erase this partition of O thing here just to open some space like this.
yeah. Yeah, then I mean, I also get rid of this as well. Yeah, then after this, you get to M2. Actually, no, you go back to D whole.
Yeah,
And
and that's
then you go-
exchangeable from.
With M2. So actually, we've extended it to be like, yeah, basically M1 CW CP EP DW.
Yeah, man, but you know, like this is
Yeah.
this is very natural. Like, for example, when Marx writes, like you have money, you buy commodity and you get extra money. He says, well, this thing here is actually money buys commodities. These commodities are labor power plus means of production. So these are parts. This make up a new commodity, and this is now changed for money. And this is the formula for capital. So you see, inside the formula of capital, there is a compositional moment, a decompositional moment in Marx himself.
So these extra resolution arrows are like they're like not really material arrows, right? Nothing is really happening, but it's more the switch in perspective. It's you're looking at something
Yeah,
either as something to be exchanged or something to be used.
yeah. And I mean, this is like, if you go to the primer, I think in point 9, when we just before we introduce that thing, we say this in 9.5. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
We say, so the third possible, like in every case, this happens already, right? In every case, you need to kind of decompose and recompose across borders and so on. And then we get to industrial capital, we say, rather than exploiting interlayer transcendental relocalization, meaning that the shift of perspectives is a shift in transcendentals, right? You saw money bought commodity. Now you reindex the commodity in a new value system because you changed countries, right? As when money is submitted to reciprocal forms of social bonds or commodities are reindexed across market boundaries, industrial capital constructs a path through compositional transformation. So it's already kind of implicit in our idea that what is going on here is that it's unpacking the black box of the objects themselves and not reindexing them in other layers, right?
So going back to Dennis's question about the arrow from M1 to the produced commodity, wouldn't that in a way be like where the space of speculation comes in, where you're looking at the difference between the money you have to invest and what you want to get out of it? And because you don't have to leave the transcendental TC, you're staying within the kind of like way that parts are broken down within that kind of like pricing field or exchange space or whatever.
I didn't understand. Like, you mean?
Well, basically, it's like the reason it's not an arrow in a sense is because you can't actually ever make that jump. That's why it's a speculative jump. That's the speculation of all investment, right? Of saying like, yeah, I think if I put this amount of money into it and produce this object D, I'll make more money. But you can't actually get that arrow. That's why it is speculative in the first place. Like the, I guess, R in your original diagram.
Yeah, you mean in the sense that since you will actually have to go through something irreversible. It's not like you can see beforehand the two things where you are and where you want to get to.
Like
I have this money and I want to get to that money. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that arrow in a way is kind of like, it's an ideological arrow within capitalism. That's what we attribute to entrepreneurs. Oh, they can see the value of things in this magical way. But actually, if you like break it down diagrammatically, you find the value for things in the exploration of the production space and stuff. You don't actually just magically see value, but it can kind of like appear almost like there should be an arrow from M1 to D, even though I don't think logically you can construct one.
Yeah, and you know what's what's nice about this, like this clarifies our discussion of socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time is precisely this sort of shifting the perspective on labor power in terms of money, right? Like when you try to map the parts of money to the parts of labor, you need something homomeric inside of labor, just as you have this homomeric parts in money, and that's where time appears.
And right, also, I think another advantage of doing this is labor only sees the very middle arrow of this, right? So I think that, like, I don't know, it gets to the point that, like, for the system to maintain itself, right, labor can never see anything outside of that, or else it would see itself surplus labor, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah,
I mean, it clarifies why labor exists in this world of parts, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the world of commodities.
That's also where the use transcendental is like most visible at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the richest, but also it like doesn't see a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? I mean, it's clear that everything combines with everything. It's the world of, you know, things turning into other things. It's much richer. It's where, you know, wholes are decomposed into their parts, but at the same time, it doesn't get to see the logic of wholes interacting, right?
And the flip side of that would be the argument that Marx makes, where for like capitalism, it appears like circulation is dominant over production, right? Because it's only looking at the level of phi, and it's kind of like obscuring. So you have like a mutual obscuring.
Yeah. So, I mean, under this thing we're talking about, the relation between exchange set and use set is this very specific thing we don't know how to define yet, which is perhaps should be called resolution, but perhaps it's something that might merit, you know, a specific name. Because if we keep resolution is very general. It's just saying ways of covering sets under certain predicates, right? With some specific restrictions. We know that resolutions that actually make up parts that are called the use set are, we can even say like the consumption, the use as consumption set is the parts of a commodity that are like these arrows, these arrows here, without the necessity that the output is still a commodity, right? So if I'm eating food, I'm decomposing. It's no longer, I'm not eating a fish. I'm eating the bites of the fish, right? Taking bites out of the fish. But the composition of the fish in my body doesn't make up a commodity, only indirectly by reproducing labor force, right? Labor power. And so the use set is a set of all morphism that goes from parts of commodities to other things. And the production use set is the more restricted case where the output is also a commodity, right? So if I were eating the fish and God forbid selling the excrement at the end of the production process, you know, then you could say that the digestive process is part of production.
Yeah. So this is kind of like saying that we started off saying, well, okay, so we have a contradiction because at the beginning we said we are in
Fuck that.
Shit. It's not a horrible. I'm just saying we need to account for, we wanted this clean division between commodities and substrates, right? We are in the universe of commodities, meaning everything is.
Look, the substrate is no longer at stake. The substrate there's only the need to call something a substrate now when something non-capitalist, some non-capitalistic combination of stuff comes into play. Then suddenly you realize there's more substrate than the use set. But other than that, that doesn't come into the play. Only at the level of the sites do we need a substrate now.
Oh, so what is this CP?
It's parts. But parts defined from above to the below, right? Parts defined by the fact they are relevant to production, not parts defined by the fact they are in the substrate.
Yeah, and when we're saying the use is I guess like concerned with the resolution of the parts, I think this is where potentially the behavioral mereology stuff might come in use.
Yeah,
right?
it's looking much more behaviory and mereology than.
Yes, where like the way in which you're saying that like the parts, when something you're mapping the parts of something to another thing, when you say that it is used, it's like in the sense that how those parts constrain the behavior overall, which is exactly the behavior mereology part, right? It's not that like when you use something, you're using this one part of it for like the entire thing, but it's that this one part of it participates in something that ends up with the whole use.
Yeah, for example, if we go back to that dramatization I proposed, everyone has their commodities, and we say the rules of the game are only do things with the whole of the commodity. You cannot break it apart. You can either put all commodities in the hand of one person, like a bundle, or you can, combine them and send them to other people in different ways, but they will all remain because the parts need to be preserved, right? And if I say, do things with the parts of your commodities, you're going to start combining those, breaking them down, putting them back together. So that way of formalizing the constraints, right? Do things that preserve the wholes, do things that mix the parts. It kind of captures exchange versus production a bit better, exchange versus consumption a bit better, right? If I say combine the parts in such a way that I can treat the things that are the end products as wholes that can be then preserved amongst each other, then I separated the productive consumption, right? Decompose these things such that the recompositions can be treated as wholes that are moving hands again, or being bundled and so on. They cannot be totally destroyed, for example. Something like that. Like it seems like it's closer, right?
Yeah, I'll have to think about it. I'm worried that this arrows from part to part is you're actually exiting the commodity world at that moment, because you're delving into parts that are not priceable.
Yeah, but this is the whole point, right? Going back here, what is the thing that is here, right? So let's say I take a part. If this is a priceable part, right? If I'm still decomposing in terms of valuable exchangeable things, there will be a commodity here that guarantees this. It will still be exchangeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the other side as well, I can find some part of DP that I can get some other commodity here that is exchangeable for it. I don't know. This is actually not correct because CP is smaller than C and DP is smaller than B, but you get the point, right? You could say that there is actually, there is actually an arrow from that first commodity we added to a part of itself, right? So if I give you a part here, CP, there is some other part of money here, a part of money that buys CP, right?
Yeah.
So all of that is fine because there's always kind of exchange relations at the level of a monetary consistent exchange space. And that's same valid here. There is some part of M2P, a part of it that it can price a part of D. So these are priceable parts. And we know, because of the distinction we made between means of production and labor power, that if I have means of production and it's valued at some amount of dollars, right? The set of all parts of MP cannot be more valuable than MP, right?
Yeah.
But for LP, that's not the case. The set of parts of LP is actually can be more valuable than LP itself, right? That's where surplus comes from. You can combine parts of labor in ways that are more valuable than labor power as a whole. And that's how we combine the continuum hypothesis with the theory of surplus value.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I just think what is missing is, I don't know.
But could you go back to the contradiction?
Yeah, the contradiction, it's not a contradiction. It's just, I'm just trying to say, my problem is that I feel like we already have this. We have this, we don't even need this CP and DP thing because we already said, like, we have priceable parts. We have a production process that respects those parts. Because to say that there's CP, that there's parts, that just means that every commodity is made up of other commodities. So it's to say that C1, we have this in our paper, right? Like C1, C2, like
yeah.
dot, like LP, right? Or actually we called it like MP1, MP2,
yeah.
labor power, right? So this is the parts. This is equal to CP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is C whole, this is CP. We're just saying that commodities are colimits, or they are comprised of a product of other commodities. So in that sense, we already have this part here. I'm just wondering what is the extra thing we're adding now?
No, that's why I mentioned in our long WhatsApp chat that I don't think that the question at stake is there is a contradiction in the bulk of the primer. The thing missing is to make the beginning more coherent with the rest, because we actually had a first beginning, we went somewhere else, and then we tried a first correction in the beginning. We added resolutions, we added the U sets are sets of morphisms and so on. But that's like our first attempt to correct this. And I think that the problem you found is just because that solution, which still has the first definitions being based on sets, and then adding all the corrections, didn't go far enough. But I don't think that what's at stake, I mean, the only reason to write this as the way we did here is to clarify a way to go back to the distinction between use and exchange sets based on errors, so that we can add at the beginning, look, what we will be calling use sets is commodity seen from this perspective, right? And what we're calling exchange sets is commodity seen from this perspective. And this change of perspective comes with some difference that we can treat in terms of maps, right? Like, that's, I think, what we're talking about. Like, ultimately, I mean, the thing that it's starting to look like to me, it's something like combining those four ideas. It's something like we define the commodity, and we say, well, to get to the exchange set of the commodity is to consider it in a way such that the commodity under its exchange perspective, it's preserving all its parts and entering into some weird kind of, I mean, either is this commutative thing, or it's the which I now think it's not even like this, it would be something like this. If I exchange C for D, that means that I can exchange D for E and get C back, which might be even too much. Perhaps the product thing is better because it captures the same idea that I can combine and decombine. That's just what it's either this or the product approach, right? And preserving this sort of properties, which are two ways of talking about parts haven't been messed with, takes us through this to this. Right? And saying that if you take this other path here, which considers them in terms of their parts, which it's probably where we can define, say, well, this is the case where you can ask about its resolution or something like this. Takes you to their use sets. Like it's the commodity plus any predicate, which is not, is it exchangeable for something else, right? Takes you here, and then we add an arrow here, which we don't know what it is right now, but it's just saying that, well, there is an operation from which you can go from parts, like looking at it as parts or looking at it as wholes, right?
The CU and the morphism G are still like determined within the capitalist world. We're not, those aren't substrate at that level.
No, forget the substrate. Like, I think that the substrate is a nice heuristic use to show to people, like it has two uses. The heuristic one is to say, yeah, like you think about the material of the commodity, substrate. Well, that's not the use set. The use set is this more restrictive thing with the matrix. So it's the heuristic sense. And then it's useful when we want to talk, for example, about cooperation, invention, technological change, where you had the use set with some resolutions. Well, there might be objects, either, for example, in the case of labor power, that explore what's beyond commodity preserving resolutions, and therefore beyond the use set that fits into the capitalist world. But then you're moving from LP, U, to S, not the other way around, which is how Badiou does it in Logics of World, right? In Logics of Worlds, you only get to talk about the multiple substrate, which is not already logically codified into a world when you get to the sites. And then the question is, what else can that material substrate help to structure, right? Which didn't exist in the situation and so on. So my impression is that all that we've been doing is rethinking what we already did, just to clarify if there are properties in the later parts of the primer which we can use to define the first section, the section 2, right? And it seems to me that this distinction between part and whole, perhaps captured by resolution, perhaps treated separately, that's kind of the thing that we're looking for to distinguish G and F, and then to see how we can define this E, but it won't be just a functor in such a way that isomorphisms in exchange must carry for use. It will be something else.
Yeah. So, okay. So to summarize, we don't need the functors yet, or
perhaps not in the same way.
Not in the same way, yeah. And instead, we are going to distinguish exchange and production imminently somehow. I'm still not sure about the triangulation thing.
Yeah, I agree. But I think
there's some way, yeah.
I mean, doesn't it seem like aren't you more convinced with the product approach?
Yeah, I think the product approach is also very similar to the your part whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So at first I was worried that part whole means there's a stratification, and then because of the stratification you cannot commute. But now I'm seeing, okay, we can actually commute. We can go from whole to part back to whole.
Yeah.
And that still works because everything's priceable.
Yeah.
Along the way.
Yeah, everything is priceable along the way. I think that's the whole point. And I mean, I think that probably that's the biggest idea in the primer. honestly, that you can account for the theory of surplus value in terms of relations between parts and wholes, because that's what we do ultimately. Like we gave a compositional theory of surplus, right? Because we define the logical space as moving from wholes to parts, only to priceable parts, and we said that not all parts of labor are priced, even though labor is priced.
Yeah.
Right. And we define the productive space as the experimental site where capitalism tries to price more parts of labor. That's our original. That's our original theory of exploitation.
Right, because in the end, it's all about the principle of parting, like a partitioning, right? we are.
It's a party theory. Nobody can tell us we don't use the party form.
Yeah, it all comes back to the party, because the labor power is partitioned according to time, according to hours, let's say. And this mechanism of partitioning leaves something out, right?
Yeah,
that's the.
It goes to the real versus rational thing that Yasha was talking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, labor is a very dense commodity, right? You can slice it up, but you can always slice it in a finer way and kind of index it back to something that was rational, right? There's something a bit more real near that vicinity, and you can exploit it and try to add it back, right?
Where on the other hand, right, the arrow from M1 to CW, there's only a certain amount of things that you can buy with M1 amount of money. It's much more restricted than what you can do with CP.
Yeah, exactly.
So is the arrow from CP to DP, is that the site? Is that where we position the site in this process?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this solution I like because of the way that it partitions labor and I guess like the exchange parts of production in a very elegant way, I think.
Yeah, I
actually helps explain some conceptual things as well.
Yeah, I think that if we find the right way to code this part versus whole, either it's because operations, exchange operations, bundling, selling together, having two sets and then exchanging the commodities that are inside of them, all of those things, I can get back to the place where I started. Like if I bring them together and say, there's an operation binding A and B, which I call an exchange act, right? Well, if it's an exchange act, it means I can unbind them at some point, right? I can inverse it and I'll get A and B separately again, right? And that seems to capture something close to preserving the whole. Whereas,
yeah, well, I mean, the only thing the exchange that changes is who owns what, like on some formal level, right? All of the commodities are the same.
Yeah.
On the level of the whole, at least.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also interesting because everything, if the world was just circulation, that's pretty much what you would see. I mean, is it totally lacking dynamic? No, because it can be the case that it accumulates in one place. Like all the money is bundled in some place, all commodities are bundled in another, or something like there is an immanent operation. This bundling is something that can happen, and versions of that, right? I had a bundle with ABC, and another had D and E, and now I have a bundle with AB and the other with DC E. I don't know which ones I started with, right? You can say that that's a way of talking about commodities changing hands more immanent, because they make up bundles that are different, right? Without having to talk about alienation, property rights, and things like this, which are a bit extrinsic at this point. Whereas if these bundles, things are now properly being combined, then it doesn't even gives the example, like if I mixed water and salt, I cannot unmix them and exchange the salt and the water separately. They were composed together, right? They weren't simply bundled, right? So I think it does capture that distinction nicely. And again, the fifth reason why I think the fifth intuition that I think goes along with the other four is that, well, this is Badiou's, again, we kind of reproduce Badiou's, like Badiou doesn't use, we had that problem, right? We didn't understand his definition of exposition of relations because it's somewhere between products and exponents, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty much where he was aiming at. Like, relations are conservative. They map everything that all the atoms in an object are mapped onto the atoms of the other, preserving their degrees of existence, right? So relations are conservative of degrees of existence of parts. And modifications are not. It's precisely when the degrees of existence of things change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much what we're doing. Like, the logic of atomic modifications changes the value of parts. The logic of relations preserves the value of parts. And I think that it's very hard to define. That's why I had a triangular idea, because that triangle looks like the mini version of the exposition of relations for money, right? Money can sit there for any two commodities, right? Because it can be exchanged for anything, because it can just find its other, a part of itself that is unique to capture the value between two things that are exchangeable, right? But what would be that triangle for the case where you don't have money yet? For the accidental form, right? That's why I thought about this minimal commutative block as being the unit of exchange. But perhaps it's not that simple. Perhaps we should think of it in terms of this other approach.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the predicate thing of Marx, right? Like commodity A is the value of commodity B.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, you would say actually there's two commodities C and D, but there's also this value. I think I forgot who said it in WhatsApp.
I think it was Alain.
Alain, yeah, he said but also there's this purpose or utility of C to reflect the value of both of these things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Here, so C and D are just normal commodities, but CV would be like the capacity for C to represent the value of D. But then again, you have this problem in Marx where when C serves as the value of D, it cannot serve as the value of itself. So
Yeah.
CV doesn't see
C itself.
C itself, right? It sees the value of D, which then.
Yeah, but you see, like, again, it makes
Maybe
sense because we always treated exchange as a directed relation and not a reciprocal thing, right? Like, since the beginning, we read Marx's statements when he says, yeah, when we're dealing with the simplest form of exchange is like this. We made a bunch of corrections, right? We said first, this is not quantity and quality. We don't know. So this is just A, and this is just B. And then we said, yeah, but you're using equality in two senses at the same time. You're saying they are equivalent, but you're also saying that this is a predicate relation. So we substituted it for an arrow because it's a direct relation. So we never conceived exchange as already being both ways, right? But we only started treating this arrow as having more arrows composing with it when we start talking about more exchanges, but then B can be exchanged with C and A can be exchanged with C as well. But perhaps in the very minimal definition of this arrow, it already implies more arrows than one, like what you're saying here, right? So even at the accidental level, there is more than just A to B. If this is an exchange of A to B, that says something else as well, right? If I can exchange A to B, that means that even though this doesn't happen, it's possible that there is for example, that's my idea, right? There is a third commodity that if B exchanged it for C, C could exchange back to A, even if it doesn't happen. But that's kind of what this arrow means. right? But perhaps there's a better way, like with this product bundling and splitting commodities that is more on point, I guess. But perhaps this is a third correction we need to make, not only to conceive of this arrow, like show it is directed and not dividing quality and quantity. Two things we already did to Mark's definition. Perhaps there is a third.
Yeah, I think we should tackle that maybe separately in another meeting, because I think that goes into the whole how much of Marx are we are we still in line with the idea that the commodity stands for the value, like it has this equivalent form and this relative form?
Yeah, no, I think it's all there, man. Like I think the only thing that's happening, the only thing we're saying is that the reason why I mentioned this is that our approach is all about taking one step back and defining things as constraints on morphisms before defining it as different registers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And two things we did with this change here is both of them are in that direction. Quantity was split from quality, we mended that. And equivalence and predication were two levels that were dialectically being unfolded, and we already made that explicit. But there is a third thing that perhaps we need to make more explicit to make this, again, a purely mapping, a purely categorical definition of exchange, which is to make explicit a third thing, which is if an arrow is an exchange arrow between A and B, some other things must hold, which are also implicit in Marx, because he has the benefit of saying use and exchange are different registers, and we don't have that benefit. So we need to be more explicit about this other conditions that make this arrow an exchange arrow, right? So he doesn't need to say something like, yeah, but if you change the quantity of X and the quantity of B, the equation still holds, because we separated quantity from quality. So the parts and whole is actually defined. The quantity and quality thing also does the role of distinguishing parts and wholes, because the whole is named A and the parts are named amount of A, right? And this is pretty much what we're trying to do now and say, look, but there's something about this part and whole thing that we want to introduce, and it concerns, uses, and it will give us the difference between use and exchange.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. In some sense, we shifted entirely to the whole, and we're trying to recover the parts using arrows.
Yeah, I think another way of saying this is that we thought that by the fact we can recover quantity afterwards with the money resolution, money atoms, and so on, that's all we had to say about parts and wholes in the beginning to make it consistent. But once we went over the distinction between quantity and quality, X amount of a commodity, we also have to be more explicit about the difference between use and exchange, because amount of quality is kind of, proportions of a use, right? So we need to have a statement about that distinction as well. It's not the same as the quality quantity distinction. So it's like a third thing that in our initial definitions is not explicit, even if as we go along, it's kind of sorts itself out in an okay way.
Yeah, and also I don't think use probably doesn't scale with quality always in like a linear or whatever way. Like for example, if you have, I don't know, something like some screws and things, right? Or whatever parts to make something. If you have one of them versus two of them, if you have two of them, then you can make two of whatever you're making. But if it's something like, I don't know, maybe this is assuming there's only one person, but something like a tool, maybe like a drill, right? It doesn't really allow you to make more things if you have two of them, if that makes sense, right? So the use doesn't always scale in the same way.
Yeah.
With quantity, which I think is maybe important to consider.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. But I think that our idea of resolutions and combining parts in production can account for that in a way. But now it seems to me like this is clearer to me that X of A means X amount of A, and you can treat this in terms of quantities of some quality, but you also need to, the fact that this varies how many parts, right? This tells you how much, but also if it's, let's say, one of a cow or half of a cow, that's a part of a cow, right? And we only kind of solved it for the quantity versus quality thing. That's kind of explicit in our, we recuperate that. But the fact that we change this for A means that now we need to explain the distinction between A considered just as the exchange and A considered as a use. This is kind of lost going here, right? And we cannot do it in a dualistic kind of substantial way with registers, because we want to treat this all inside the same category and just restrict it and say, like, for example, I think this is a really good example you gave, Yasha. Like, from the exchange point of view, 2 drills is always better than 1 because I can exchange it for the double of 1 drill, right? I'm not concerned with how drills compose with screws, and I won't be nobody is going to be holding 2 drills, 1 in each hand, right? That doesn't matter. But when I change from the perspective of use, how drills compose with other things becomes relevant. So that shift of perspective is like restricting the drill in 2 different ways. 2 drills as quantities of commodities that are exchangeable by the double, exchangeable for the double of money, right? And then 2 drills in the sense that 2 drills I cannot screw doubly fast with 2 drills. That's the other perspective, right? I won't be able to combine more screws per minute because I have 2 drills instead of 1 if I only have 1 person. That's what I think this operation we're looking for. If it is, how products and colimits and things like this allow us to bundle and unbundle things. If it is some other more resolution-based approach, and we introduce resolution and in a way that allows us to move towards this, we can look at it from all different predicates up to the predicate of, the commodity as a whole, like the commodity as an exchangeable object. And that's a predicate, right? And then you could even define it like that and say the resolution, which is a list of other commodities treated as a predicate, right? That's the exchange resolution, and it only keeps the whole of the commodity, right? Something like that. Perhaps that's there's a predicative solution as well. I don't know, but whatever solution we find, I think it's ultimately to make these 2 arrows here work, and not to define them in a set-based way, to define them by these arrows. I don't know, Dennis, what are we still in rustled, or are we?
Are we rustled? No, I think we're not rustled. I think it's impressive. Like, it gives me a new appreciation for capital and the beginning of where Marx introduces this contradiction between use and exchange. Like, it's good to see that it is actually it's not an easy problem to just you can't just make it go away, right? Like, you one way or the other, the contradiction follows you around, I think.
Yeah. The thing that I think it's clearer on our end than on Marx's, and I think that it's what really makes, to be honest with you, you can find this explicit in a text by Badiou called The Factory as a Site. It's a text that was supposed to go into being an event, and he didn't include, but it was a chapter that he removed, and that he uses this, sets versus parts approach to talk about commodities. There's the only place where he ventured into something like this. So, but the appreciation of Marx is, goes up, of course, but I also find it I'm really convinced that if the primer holds, we have a concrete way of showing that use value is a type of value. It's not the ahistorical being of things. You know, many people treat what Marx is presenting as if he was saying exchange value is this historically specific thing that people do in capitalism, looking at things abstractly. And use value is the nice look at the concrete body of things. And we can show that that's not true. Use value is historically specific to capitalism. It's all the ways we partition things under the constraints of the more general constraints of value. It's not like the substrate of things in themselves, right?
Yeah, that's important. Yeah,
yeah, that's really important. I mean, like I don't know in the literature in Marxism, like a very good, clear distinction of these three, actually of four concepts rather than two. Like the vulgar reading is exchange value, use value. More sophisticated reading is saying, no, there's value, which splits off into use and exchange. But it's always ambiguous as to how material use is. Like they want to say specific to capitalism, but how can they say it's specific? Specific in which way? And I think that now we have four concepts. We have value, use, exchange. And so value is seen through exchange, but the substrate of the commodity is seen through use value, which is the logically determined appearance of the material of the commodity under the logic of value, right? Parts that can either are priced, could be priced, or could go under a new priced object, right? And there's still a lot in an object that is neither one of those three things. It's in the substrate, but it's neither of the three. So making that kind of coherent, I think it's a really, really big contribution.
Yeah, I think that contribution is safe, even if we don't resolve this issue.
Yeah,
I think we were doing that. I think our issue is mainly like how there are many ways to express this in categories, right? We're trying. Our first attempt was, like you said, we tried to use sets to kind of distinguish things. Now we want to use arrows to distinguish things.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether we use sets or arrows, we're not changing any conceptual.
Yeah, I think that's safe. Yeah. I mean, I think we can try our hand then, is if you want, like during the week to go back to the primer and just see if we can think of how to insert something else in place and bring to discussion something more concrete. But I do think that like a path to solve this is clearer now, you know?
Yeah, I think what I will do is I go through the text and find every point where use sets are utilized, right?
Yeah.
Where we depend on use sets. That will tell us the damage of removing.
Yeah, but you know,
concept.
like what my point is, do we need to remove it? Or can't we just do like an alternative strategy is just to add a step before the use and exchange sets, which is we have commodity preserving things that take commodities and go to commodities. There are many things, there are some trivial things and not so trivial things. Well, we can, at this level of generality, distinguish two types of morphisms. And then we need to introduce, I mean, my impression is that if we go to the primer now, it's like we remove point 2, which has the use and exchange things. So we probably have to rethink point 2, 2.0, right? Shit, it's a lot of stuff. Yeah, I would probably rethink point 2, introduce it in a slightly different way, and probably more classically, like people doing categories. Like, let C be the category where objects are commodities and morphisms are, you know, transformations between commodities. These can be, you know, bundlings of commodities, which are very trivial, all the way up to transforming a set of commodities into some other commodity. At this level of generality, all we can do is to show that there are two big classes of morphisms, defined by different ways that they allow composition, or how they deal like with products, or some operation we want to find. We're not very clear about it, right? So rather than 2.1.2 with the set CU, we would, at this level, we would already, like from 2 to 2.1, we would change it to reflect those restrictions on morphisms. And we would call those morphisms exchange relations, and we would call those other morphisms consumption relations or use relations, right? And then once we have those things, the next step is to reintroduce the set and say, there is a functor from the class of exchange morphisms to something in set, which is called the exchange set, which is indexing these morphisms to the commodities they're going to. So I can list the morphisms that take my commodity to true exchange morphisms to another commodity by the sets of those other commodities, right? A set that correlates to that commodity, something like this, right?
And that would be like the constructive aspect, right?
That would be the constructive,
yeah.
Yeah, I will go from the morphism to the set. So exchange sets are also sets of arrows with some compositional constraint. And the use set is the set of all arrows that took this commodity to other commodities in terms of their parts, as we were talking about, or which is pretty similar to our definition already, but that's coming last, as a functor to set, right? Then if we can find a neat way to talk about how those two projections to sets relate, fine. But if they don't, it just allows us to refer to the set definition because they are indexing the arrows. So it's just simpler, and then we can use the references later on to use sets and exchange sets, and that's fine. They're just indexing the arrows.
Right. So it's not that, we need to change. Actually, really, I think the main thing is changing this one.
Yeah.
Which is saying any commodity preserving map needs to have some elements in the in the exchange set and the use set, right? It's a very complicated line here, but it just means like there is something in the use set and there is something in the exchange set of the target.
Yeah.
Of this
arrow.
Yeah,
you could still have a similar definition where rather than just like something in the exchange set and something in the use set, it's more like if you can produce, right, an arrow that has the correct properties of being either use or change or both.
Yeah.
Rather than like we already have this set and we pull something from it. If that makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that looking here, I think that this might make us ultimately push 2.3 back up. So it talks about commodity bundles, coproducts, colimits. That might come first.
Right.
So a general definition of commodity maps or the category, like trivial operations of bundling, then the restrictions to exchange maps and use maps, then the mappings to set, So like I would say we probably need to change up to 2.4 because that's where I see after 2.4 I don't see any definitions on CU or CE. They're straight on C, like the resolutions and so on.
Okay, and then what about 3 though? Because at 3 we talk about the this inverse arrows.
Yeah.
Are we keeping the inverse arrows?
Well, I have the impression that the existence of inverse arrows is very. Again, going from the intuitions we just developed, like if this exchange operations are kind of akin to the bundling, like if a more vague definition is like I can bundle them and unpack them back, right? If that's our first approach to exchange, inverse is kind of implied. I can bundle them and unbundle them. I can it seems like isn't that a special, like the definition of the inverse is like a special case of that, right? Like if I have A and B, I can have both A and B on one side, I can have B on the side of A, or I can have them switch. Like, right? Let's say I have each one has a basket, and there are one commodity in each basket. Well, they can both be in one basket, they can remain in their baskets, or they can switch baskets. Switching baskets is a special case of the general, let's bundle them in every way, right?
Yeah, I think I kind of see what you're saying, because we're saying that, yeah, nothing is irreversible when we say that.
Yeah, I think that
the bundling.
Yeah, exactly.
Bundling is always reversible. I mean, there's a certain type of bundle which is reversible, and that's what we need to somehow define exchange in terms of that reversibility of bundling.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that ultimately this is the sort of insight we want to code into the primer. Like, there's something about exchange which is reversible, and there's something about use that is irreversible, right?
I mean, would the reversibility not just be the existence of the inverse, no?
Yeah, but the problem with the inverse here is that it's defined on, it implies the use and exchange set, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just with inverses, we run into the problem of if later on we want to use a use functor, the use functor again will need to preserve these inverses, but but we don't necessarily want that. Like, we don't want to say just because this is exchangeable here, it's the uses are
yeah, I mean, that's true.
Isomorphic,
like,
right?
yeah, so if I have a isomorphic, no, but there's some other operation that is preserved, which is if I have the commodity A in a basket and a commodity B in a basket, and they shift baskets, then they shift back. That preserves the, let's say, the use identity for A.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So like,
but
A,
not
B,
halfway through.
Right. You're saying, yeah, exchanges always look like this. Like,
yeah,
there's some arrows that take A and B to A times B or some bundle, and that also allow you to break them apart later.
Yeah.
So this replaces this, right? Instead of saying this and this, F and F minus, this is the old way. We want to do this way instead. And
yeah, and because we can oppose this way to use.
Yeah.
And my point is, like, if you look at my stupid example, right? So for use, this is not the case, right? If I compose them, I cannot decompose them, right? Like, it's kind of that irreversible thing we're talking about. If I put two things in my grocery cart, I can take them out and pay each one separately. But if I mix water and salt, I cannot separate them and pay for them separately, or just alienate myself from one of and not from the other, right?
Yeah, even if you had a process which could separate them, you would be expending some energy.
Something else needs to compose with them. Yeah.
Yeah, which then you could not extract that thing. You could not undo that process. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the interesting thing that I just realized is that you were talking about, like when I say I have an operation F between A and B that has the inverse F minus 1, we were calling this exchange. But if we have a functor to the use sets, that wouldn't be valid.
Yeah.
But kind of, I mean, it is valid under the exchange, not valid in general.
Yeah.
But while exchange is happening, that's true, in fact. Like, if I have a commodity, you have a commodity, I sell it to you, and then you sell it back to me. That double path of use, suddenly I had a different use in my hand, the money, and now I have my commodity back in my hand. Use goes back to use, right?
Yeah.
It's just halfway that doesn't work.
Yeah, but the problem is it's kind of all or nothing when we're talking about this commutative diagram, where again, M1, M2, right? M prime, C, D. So here we're exchanging, right? from M to C. This implies, if we're going with the inverses, this implies C and M are isomorphic.
Yeah.
Right, and same here. So now if we apply the functor use, we are saying that the use of M is the same or isomorphic to the use of C, and the use of D is isomorphic to the use of M prime U.
Yeah, which I mean, again, if we took the resolution or the parts and whole approach, that would be true. I mean, insofar as its use predicate is being sold or being exchangeable or being sellable, having DU in your hands and having M prime U in your hands is the same. Or
Yeah,
it's
I
meant to
agree.
be the same.
Yeah. If there was another step that we added so that this becomes CP,
yeah,
then we're fine, because we're saying, okay, this move is not invertible. Like, there's no isomorphism between, which is actually an odd statement. I mean, it's not a trivial statement, right? That the C whole is not isomorphic to the C part.
Yeah.
Because if this is also isomorphic, we just move the problem again, because that means C, if M is isomorphic to CW and CW is isomorphic to CP, then that means CP must be isomorphic to M. So we have the same problem again.
Yeah, but I think that once we remember that, I mean, again, the resolution thing, I think as it is, I'm not sure if it's perfect, but it's already kind of
yeah, resolutions work because resolutions are not invertible.
Yeah.
If we see Cedar and if we see two types of items as the same, that doesn't mean that we can go back and like we're losing information. But the whole point of resolution is that we're losing information, so we cannot go back.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what is happening here. I mean, this might already in itself solve the main problem.
Yeah, I have the impression that the moment that I mean, from the definition we're trying to give now to point 2, that functor U, it's not really how we're going to move from exchange to use, right? I think it will become clearer as we go. And as you said, point 3 might need to be rephrased just to be more coherent with what came before. But I think it's the core of the issue is from 2.0 to 2.4, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, also there definitely is a functor going the opposite direction, right? From use to exchange. That is kind of like tautological, right?
Yeah.
But like the construction the other way around, right? Going from exchange to use is kind of like what you like, I guess it's like the act of the construction, like within the capitalist world. Is you see what things are being exchanged for your commodity, and then you learn some information about it based on what other people are exchanging it for, right? Or you try to get something from the use of it, from that information, from like the data within the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the order of reasons is becoming clear to me now, because phenomenologically, what we're discussing today is how to capture the fact that, I mean, regardless of the arrows and how to find the right constraint to define use versus exchange, like it's not invertible, Marx's phrase, that in capitalism, people produce to exchange, right? It's not true. I mean, everyone is producing to exchange, but not everyone is exchanging to produce.
Mm-hmm.
So the first statement is the one where we're captured. I mean, that's why the CP and CW are not invertible, right? It's true that when I look at an object, its material body, I can think about, well, if I have this commodity, it's like I have some amount of money. They are its use set and the use set of money under their resolution. It's a very capitalist one, right? Of producing to exchange. So exchange being, let's say, the predicate that I'm evaluating that use, that holds. To have some commodity under some conditions is to have some capital, what Marx called capital commodity, right? Money in the form of commodity, right? So in some sense, it makes sense. We want to push the idea that there is the, let's say, money resolution of commodities, not only the money resolution of money, right? That's what time is for labor. It's how we look at labor, thinking labor towards value, right? Labor so that value is preserved. So it makes sense that the move from CW, the whole of commodity, to the parts of commodity, if we do keep that isomorphism, that functor between use and exchange, we could say for it that it holds, like from the perspective of production for selling, to have the output commodity and to have the money that you will get when they sell it, both have the same use, right? But the inverse is not true in capitalism. So it's okay that it's not true for us. It's not true that produce to exchange and that exchange to produce. So if two things are exchangeable, that tells me how to consume them. That's not what's at stake. It's the contrary, right?
So you're saying basically only capital in general exchanges in order to produce, in order to exchange again, right? That's the MCM.
Yeah, it buys productive things to sell them in order to sell them, where everyone else buys stuff in order to consume and to stay alive and to enjoy or whatever, right? But I think that I have the impression that once we start messing with section 2, I think we will find I'm more confident we'll find a good solution, and that it won't require to change everything after. Like it might even simplify something later on, you know?
It seems like something with the resolutions helps clarify like how commodities are seen by different people or by different actors, right? So like how the capitalist sees the commodity and how like a laborer sees a commodity are very different. And I think by making like the subtle distinctions, like by like changing from the part to the whole resolution, might be, and it seems like it is like approximately the right level of like nuance to distinguish between those two.
Yeah, I have the impression. I mean, the reason why I'm leaning towards the product versus this undecomposable thing, or like the difference between bundling and combining, as John was talking about here in the chat. Like, you don't need resolutions at that level to talk about this, right? It's very loose. Like some ways of combining will make parts lose information. Some ways of bundling will preserve all the information of parts, something like this. Resolution already seems like, once I know that there are parts that have different properties, I want to ask the question, how do I navigate between those things? And then the resolution would come at that point. Like, I think that if we introduce resolution too early, we never mention parts of commodity, right? It's too soon. So I would leave it at 2.5 as it is, like as a very important operator that needs to come in the first formal section, but like not as to push it so way back that that is like the fundamental concept. You know, I would talk about these two morphisms we've been talking about, two ways of composing some arrows, divide, use, and exchange, and then do exactly as we did with resolutions, which is once you have this use set, which we now are constructing differently, then you talk about resolutions and as a way of navigating that set and covering in different ways. You know, we can add perhaps. Sorry, Dennis. Yeah.
I agree, because we need the use set definition to be in place before we can do resolutions, at least the way we have it right now. Otherwise, resolution becomes a very vague notion of like a point of view that is we can apply to almost anything. And right now we're specifically saying resolutions are always use resolutions. They're determined by what you can do, and sometimes you see two things by what they can do as being the same.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think resolution should come second, like third. So general morphisms in the category, then composition restricting exchange and use morphisms, then the set definition of these sets of arrows, then resolutions, and then if we think we can do it, we can add the proviso at the end of the resolution operator and say, by the way, you could treat that distinction we just made between use and exchange as if it's an arrow taking from use back to exchange in terms of the resolution being exchangeable for, or something that way.
Yeah.
That's like the strategy in my mind right now. Like there is this category with morphisms that takes commodities to commodities. Well, we can restrict those morphisms into two big classes. We'll call one exchange and one use based on this difference here. We can project this to sets and call the exchange set the use set. We can explore the use sets using resolutions, and we can take you from the use set back to the exchange set by defining like a specific type of predicate for the resolution, which forgets all the information, but it's one way from use to exchange. It cannot take you back. So we explicitate the fact that it's not invertible, right? At that point, we would be ending 2.5 with that triangle we said. Commodity, like the F and G arrows going to exchange and use sets, right? It's a bit more tricky, but still. And then one arrow, if we can define it, going from the resolution discussion on use sets back to exchange sets.
But not the other way.
Not the other way. I mean,
exchange back to use.
Yeah, because given the two things are exchangeable, doesn't mean I can find a resolution more strict than the exchange itself, under which their uses are indiscernible, right? But the inverse is true. Given that that I have two commodities that are different and they have different use resolutions and so on, I can find a resolution under which those differences don't matter, and which is the purely quantitative comparison of their value.
We have to go from the more information-rich space to the less information-rich.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think that solves your problem with the fact that when we go from CW to CP, you cannot go back. Once you went from one to the once you end exchange and you go into use, you cannot, like, that passage is not the same as the inverse passage, right? It doesn't guarantee that you'll get the same thing.
Yeah, that one's weird because the whole is less rich than the parts, right? So like CW seems less rich, but we're going from CW to CP. Or like it's more like unpacking. Like you have this thing that's like seems very basic when you exchange, and then you unpack it during production, and now it has all this richness. Yeah. But maybe that's just like two aspects of the same.
Because
it only seems simple
you're unpacking it
as one, right?
Yeah.
It's only simple because when you exchange, you treat it as this simple.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that once we start chewing on these ideas, I think they'll fall more into place. But I already think I think this makes more sense with the whole of the primer as well, you know?
Yeah. Sorry, specifically with that in exchange, right? Like what Dennis was talking about earlier about when if two things are exchangeable, when then you can consider them isomorphic. That's basically just saying they like have the same value, right?
Yeah.
So that's like, it's forgetting all other differences and only remembering value, which is like, right? So it's like flattening everything else. So that's the way in which we're looking at it as one, right?
Yeah, I think that we might find out that the arrow from use sets back to exchange sets, it has an added restriction. Like, it's not that once we're looking at the parts of commodities, well, let's just forget their differences, and that's giving us the fact that they're all interchangeable. Yeah, they could be interchangeable in the sense that in some proportion they are exchangeable, right? But that doesn't mean that they are equivalent, right? It just means that we went to the perspective of the whole where we can make meaningful statements comparing them, right? To one thing, which is money. But that doesn't mean that we made them all exchangeable, and it's trivial that everything can be exchanged for everything. Oh, in the sense that it has, I mean, I think the point is that this added arrow will not allow us to say everything has the same value. It will allow us to say everything is just value.
Right.
Right.
The space of value is it's still differentiated. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
the space of value is not just like everything's the same value. It does have its own measuring stick, and
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, so we're like filtering it through that measuring stick. Okay, so
great,
I gotta
guys.
go.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
I feel like we're doing better than Frege, so that's enough for me.
Nice. Okay, talk to you soon.
See you guys.
Have a good week.
Thanks. Talk to you
See
soon.
you, John and John. Bye bye.
Bye.
Take care.